HTML elements have many attributes that anyone can use for a host of reasons. Like for instance, you can do something as small as changing the height of an element by 1 pixel using the style attribute, or you can access the whole element using something like a class or an ID and then do all kinds of stuff on that element inside your JavaScript. Each attribute has its own specific use case, and it only makes sense for us to use it by complying with that use case. But what if I want my own custom attribute? What if I want to store information inside an HTML element natively without a potentially risky workaround? Well, I can do that using data attributes. Let's quickly take a look at an example. So we have this empty project over here, which has an HTML, CSS and a JavaScript file. I'll first create a very simple container component inside my HTML. This component will have a class first, and then there will be a data attribute. So this is the syntax of a data attribute. You normally specify the name of the attribute, which is going to be theme in this case. And this attribute will have a prefix, which is basically data with a hyphen. So anytime you want to create a data attribute, it's going to look similar to this. So using this data attribute, we are going to either set the theme of the application to dark mode or light mode. Now to use this data attribute inside my JavaScript, I first need to get a hold of my HTML element. So I'll be using document.querySelector, which will look for the app container, and I'll store it inside a variable. Now if I want to access the data attributes present on this HTML element, I can do that in a couple of ways. The first way would be to use a method called getAttribute. So I'll just use the container element and call the getAttribute method on this element. This method requires the name of the data attribute. So in this case, it's going to be data and theme. And I'll simply console log this attribute to see if it works. I'll save this and my HTML file, and I'll try to run this on the browser. So my application is now running, and if I open up the console, I'll see that I have this dark string over here, which is basically the value of the attribute that we had set in our HTML. This method also has a counterpart, which is used to set an attribute on the HTML element. So if I just set attribute on the container element, it's going to have a name, let's say data test 1, and it's going to have a value which is of the type string. So let me just set it to ABC. If I go back to my application and try to see what is on my app container, you can see that I have this data theme attribute which we had set earlier. And after that, this data test1 attribute, which we just set using this set attribute method. So this is a very convenient way of setting attributes on your HTML elements, and get attribute is the way to access those elements. Now the second way to access attributes, and more specifically data attributes, is what I prefer. You can use a property called Dataset to get access to the data attributes on an element. So for this example, let me just add a few data attributes over here. So now I have these two attributes here, test1 and test2. If I want to access all the attributes that I have on my app container, I can just simply use the dataset attribute. So container.dataset. Now if I'll just comment these two out. So now if I go back to my browser and open up the console, I have this object which is a DOM string map. It's just a typical object, so it's going to have key value pairs. And we have these attributes here, which are all data attributes, as you can see over here. So using this dataset property on your HTML element, you can get access to all your data attributes. You can also see that there's no data prefix over here. these keys only have the actual attribute name. So normally the structure of a data attribute used to look like this. It started with data, followed by a hyphen, and then the actual name of the attribute. But when you try to access the dataset property, it gives you the name directly. It removes the data and the hyphen which is added at the beginning. And even if you try to create properties which has hyphens in it, so if I just convert this attr1 to attr1 prop, for instance, it will convert it into camel case. It will remove the hyphen in the beginning and capitalize the first letter of the second word. So it converts the properties after the data hyphen string, after this substring, to camel case. Essentially, you are going to get this as your property in the dataset object. So this way of accessing data attributes is super convenient. And if at all you want to update any of these attributes, it's again pretty straightforward. So if I come back to my script file and I don't want the value of this property to be test1, instead I want it to be test1234 or something like that, I can simply assign it a new value like you would in case of any typical variables. So container.dataset.attr1 and prop. This is what we were getting here, so we'll need to use this name, and I'll set it to, let's say, ABCD. Now if I check my map, you can see that the value has been changed. So it's that easy. You can simply assign any value to your data attributes, but one thing that you need to remember is that these values need to be of the type string. Even if you, for instance, add like a number to this attribute, it's eventually going to convert it into a string. So now I'll just remove these properties from here, and I don't need these. And now let's try to actually set up the dark theme functionality that we intended to at the beginning. So let's just quickly add a button here first, which will basically toggle the modes. So this is going to be toggle mode. It will have an ID of mode trigger. Inside the script, I'll access the button. So ptn equals to and inside my style sheet, I'll just add a few styles to my container element. It's going to have a width of 100 viewport width. Sorry, it's going to be 100, and the height is going to be 100 viewport height. So now we need to conditionally set the background of the application based on the attribute. So in CSS, if you want to access attributes, you can simply do that by adding square brackets first, and inside these square brackets you can just pass in the name of the attributes. So in our case it's going to be theme, and in case of dark theme we'll need the background to be black. I just copy the whole thing and create one for the light theme, which will have a background of white. Now coming back to my script file, so now what we need to do is add a click event on this button. So whenever I click on this toggle mode button, it will go and look at the data attribute of this app container element. It will see what it's currently set to. So if it's currently set to dark mode, then it needs to set it to light mode, and vice versa. So I'll just quickly add an event listener to this button, which is going to be a click event listener. So it's going to listen for click events, and this will have a function as a callback, which will first check if containers dataset theme is set to dark. If yes, container data theme will be set to light. in the else block, it's going to be the same, but it will set it to dark. If I save this and go back to my application, now by default we have the dark mode set over here, so it's going to be dark. If I click on toggle, so it's telling me that it cannot read properties of undefined over here. So undefined, this is, oh okay, this is not data, it's data set. Now if I go back and try to toggle it, you see that it works. So it's basically looking at the attribute value, which is set to dark by default, and it's setting it to light when we click on it. So you can see how easy it becomes to conditionally style or even conditionally render HTML elements using these custom data attributes. Again, this is not something extraordinary, and there are other, probably more elegant ways to achieve similar functionality. But this, in my opinion, makes it easier for someone to understand the flow of data from your HTML elements to your scripts or your style sheets. You can at any point use an attribute normally without the data prefix. So this is also valid. If I set theme without the data prefix and set it to dark and open up my container, I can see that there's a theme attribute also present over here. So this again is not invalid HTML, it's perfectly fine. But the problem here is that it poses a risk for the future, because HTML could at any point release a standard wherein they would have an attribute with the same name which does something completely different. Even though it's highly unlikely, it's still an unnecessary risk that you can avoid simply by using data attributes. So yeah, this was a beginner friendly video on how to store data inside your HTML elements using data attributes. I'm sure there's many more things that you can achieve using these attributes. You can experiment with them in your free time to figure out its true potential. If you have any doubts or suggestions, you can put them in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.